They left me in a truck stop bathroom. No phone, no wallet, no coat, just the buzz of flickering fluorescent lights and a filthy mirror reflecting the face of a woman who had given everything to the very people who just drove off without her. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hands shaking from cold and shock. The automatic soap dispenser was broken, dripping pink liquid onto the grimy floor. Outside, I could hear trucks rumbling past, their engines fading into the distance like my hopes of this being some terrible mistake. When the janitor found me, I must have looked like a ghost. "Ma'am, you okay?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. "How do you tell a stranger that your own children abandoned you like garbage?" He let me use his phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed Michael's number. Straight to voicemail. Jessica's phone rang once, then nothing. Brian didn't even pick up. 29 missed calls later, one text finally came through. "We thought it would be funny, Mom." Funny. My 3 children thought leaving their 67-year-old mother stranded 300 miles from home was funny. It started that morning when Michael picked me up for Cousin Harold's funeral. I should have seen the signs. The way Jessica smirked when I got in the van. How Brian kept whispering to Michael in the front seat, shooting glances at me in the rearview mirror. "Mom, you sure you want to go?" Jessica had asked. "It's a long drive, and you know how you get carsick." I didn't get carsick. I never had. But they all nodded like this was common knowledge. The funeral was 3 hours away in Millbrook. Harold had been like a brother to me after Thomas died. His passing felt like losing another piece of my old life. I needed to be there to say goodbye. But something felt wrong from the moment we left. My kids were too quiet, too careful with their words. Michael kept checking his phone. Jessica had this strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. Brian drummed his fingers on the window like he was counting down to something. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just thinking about Uncle Harold," Michael said quickly, too quickly. I settled back in my seat, watching familiar landscapes blur past. I had no idea I was riding toward my own betrayal. At the funeral, I overheard Michael whispering to his cousin Danny near the back of the church. "Operation Freedom is officially in motion," he said, his voice barely audible over the organ music. I assumed he meant something about Harold's estate. My cousin had been successful, and family members were probably wondering about inheritance. These things happened at funerals. People got greedy. But then Jessica joined them, and I caught fragments of their conversation. Bathroom stop, mile marker 143, and finally free. They scattered when they saw me looking. During the service, I focused on Harold's life, remembering our childhood adventures and the way he'd stepped up after Thomas passed. He'd been the one to help me navigate the legal papers, the one who insisted I deserved better for my children. "Your kids treat you like hired help," he'd said last Christmas. Thomas wouldn't stand for it. I'd brushed off his concerns then. Harold always worried too much. But sitting in that church pew, watching my children text instead of mourning, I wondered if he'd seen something I'd missed. After the service, Brian appeared at my elbow. "Ready to head home, Mom? Long drive ahead." I nodded, still thinking about Harold's words. I should have listened. My niece Kelly approached me after the burial, her face twisted with concern. She glanced around nervously before pulling out her phone. "Aunt Esther, I need to show you something," she whispered. "I probably shouldn't, but it's not right." The screenshot made my blood freeze. It was from a group chat called The Burden Squad. My children's names were right there at the top. Michael. Phase 1 complete. She actually believed we wanted her company, lol. Jessica. I can't wait to see her face when she realizes. Mom's getting too clingy anyway. This'll teach her some independence. The messages went back months. Cruel jokes about my cooking. My questions about their lives. My need for their company. They called me The Burden, like it was my actual name. Kelly's hand touched my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Aunt Esther. I know they're your kids, but this is wrong." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. These were the children I'd raised alone after Thomas died. The ones I'd worked 3 jobs to support through college. The ones I'd believed loved me despite their busy lives and short visits. "Thank you for showing me," I managed to say. Kelly squeezed my arm. "Are you okay?" I wasn't. I wouldn't be for a long time. The ride home was torture. Every mile marker felt like a countdown to something terrible. My children chatted about work and weather while I sat in the back, Harold's voice echoing in my memory. When we stopped at the truck stop, Brian announced he needed to use the bathroom. "Mom, you should go too. Long stretch ahead." I didn't need to go, but something in his tone made me comply. The bathroom was disgusting, but I went through the motions. When I came out, I looked for our van in the parking lot. It wasn't there. I walked around the entire lot twice, thinking I'd gotten confused. Maybe they'd moved to get gas. But there was no blue minivan anywhere. No Michael, no Jessica, no Brian. Just empty parking spaces and the distant hum of highway traffic. I stood there for 20 minutes before reality hit. They'd actually done it. They'd driven away and left me stranded. Their own mother, abandoned like an unwanted pet. A truck driver saw me crying and offered to call someone. That's when I borrowed the janitor's phone and made those 29 calls. That's when I got the text that shattered what was left of my heart. "We thought it would be funny, Mom." Nothing about this was funny. A kind trucker named Pete offered to drive me home. He was heading that direction anyway, and something about my situation reminded him of his own mother. The 4-hour ride gave me time to think, to plan, to let my shock transform into something harder. Pete didn't ask many questions, but he shared stories about his family, his struggles, his regrets. "Family's supposed to be there for you," he said as we pulled into my driveway. "I'm sorry yours ain't." I thanked him and walked to my front door, exhausted and heartbroken. But when I put my key in the lock, it wouldn't turn. I tried again, thinking I was shaking too hard from the day's events. The key didn't fit. They'd changed the locks. I stood on my own porch, locked out of the house I'd called home for 30 years. The house Thomas and I had bought as newlyweds. The house where I'd raised our children, nursed them through illnesses, celebrated their achievements. My phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "Mom, we thought you'd be happier with some space. The spare key is under the flower pot." There was no flower pot. There never had been. Just another cruel joke in what was becoming the worst day of my life. I sat on my porch steps and cried until Mrs. Henderson from next door came over with a cup of tea and the number for a locksmith. The family meeting the next morning was worse than the abandonment. They arrived together, united in their gaslighting, their faces wearing masks of concern that couldn't hide their underlying irritation. "Mom, you're overreacting," Michael said, settling into Thomas's old chair like he owned it. "It was just a prank." "A prank?" I stared at him. "You left me 300 miles from home with nothing." Jessica rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic. We knew you'd figure it out." "How was I supposed to figure it out? I had no phone, no money, no way to get home." Brian shrugged. "You managed, didn't you? Sometimes you need to learn to be more independent." They took turns minimizing what they'd done, called it a joke, a lesson, a way to help me grow. They suggested I was remembering things wrong, that I was getting forgetful in my old age. "Maybe you should see a doctor," Jessica said. "Memory issues run in families." I felt like I was losing my mind. These were the children I'd sacrificed everything for, and they were treating me like I was the problem, like abandoning their elderly mother was somehow my fault. When I brought up the group chat, they denied it existed. "Kelly must have made that up," Michael said. "You know how she is." But I knew what I'd seen. That night, I sat in Thomas's study, surrounded by photo albums and memories. Pictures of my children's first steps, graduation days, wedding ceremonies. I'd been there for everything, working myself to exhaustion to make their dreams possible. After Thomas died suddenly at 52, I'd taken 3 jobs to keep our house and pay for their college educations. I cleaned offices at dawn, worked retail during the day, and did bookkeeping at night. I lived on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee for years. Michael had wanted to study engineering. I'd worked extra shifts to pay for his expensive textbooks and lab fees. When he graduated, he'd hugged me and promised to take care of me when I got old. Jessica had dreamed of law school. I'd taken out loans against the house to pay her tuition. She'd sworn she'd pay me back once she was established. That was 12 years ago. Brian had struggled in school, but excelled at art. I'd supported his unpaid internships, his experimental phases, his creative pursuits. He'd said I was the best mother in the world. Looking at those photos now, I realized I'd been raising strangers. The children smiling back at me from the pictures wouldn't have abandoned their mother at a truck stop. They wouldn't have called her the burden behind her back. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost them. Or maybe they'd never been mine to begin with. I spent the next morning digging through Thomas's old papers, looking for something I'd almost forgotten. When he died, there had been so much paperwork, so many legal documents. My children had helped me sort through everything, claiming the estate lawyers were too expensive and confusing. "We'll handle it, Mom," Michael had said. "Family should stick together." At the bottom of a dusty file box, I found what I was looking for: a business card for Mr. Patterson, the lawyer who'd handled Thomas's original will. I'd tried to contact him years ago, but my children insisted it wasn't necessary. "Everything's been settled," Jessica had assured me. "The paperwork was complicated, but we took care of it." I'd trusted them. Thomas's life insurance had seemed smaller than expected, and the house had somehow ended up with complicated ownership details I didn't understand. But my children were educated professionals. Surely they knew best. Now, holding Mr. Patterson's card, I wondered what I'd missed. I called his office, expecting to learn he'd retired or moved on. But the secretary transferred me directly to him, and his voice was warm with recognition. "Mrs. Thompson, I've wondered about you for years. How are you managing?" "I need to ask you about Thomas's estate," I said carefully. "There are some things I don't understand." "Of course. Can you come in this week?" Mr. Patterson's office smelled like old books and coffee. He was grayer than I remembered, but his eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He pulled out a thick file with Thomas's name on the tab. "I have to be honest, Mrs. Thompson. I've been concerned about your case for years. When you stopped returning my calls, I assumed you'd found other representation." "I never got any calls," I said slowly. His eyebrows rose. "I called multiple times, left messages with your son Michael. He said you were overwhelmed and needed time." My stomach dropped. "What messages?" Mr. Patterson flipped through the file, pulling out copies of documents I'd never seen. "Your husband's will was very clear. Everything was to go to you for your lifetime, then be divided among the children after your death. But someone filed power of attorney papers claiming you were incapacitated." He showed me a signature that was supposedly mine. It was close, but the loops were wrong, the pressure too light. Someone had practiced my handwriting, but not perfectly. "I questioned this at the time," Mr. Patterson continued. "It seemed strange that you'd suddenly need a power of attorney when you'd been handling everything fine, but your children insisted you were having memory issues." I stared at the forged signature, my hands trembling. "I never signed this." "I suspected as much, but by the time I tried to reach you directly, your phone had been disconnected." The bank records were devastating. Mr. Patterson had spent the week gathering documents, and the trail of theft was clear. Over 6 years, $143,000 had been systematically transferred from accounts I didn't even know I had. Thomas's life insurance payout had been $200,000, not the $50,000 my children claimed. His pension benefits had continued after his death, providing monthly payments that should have been coming to me. Stock options from his company had matured into significant value. All of it had been redirected to accounts controlled by my children. "The power of attorney gave them legal access," Mr. Patterson explained. "They could make financial decisions on your behalf, but the way they used it was clearly fraudulent." I felt sick looking at the transaction records. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as they grew bolder. Money that should have been keeping me comfortable in my retirement had been funding their lifestyles. Michael had bought a new house 2 years ago. "Business is good," he'd said when I admired it. Jessica had taken expensive vacations, posting photos from Europe and Hawaii. "Law firm bonus," she'd explained. Brian had opened his art studio, claiming he'd saved every penny. They'd been living off Thomas's memory while I struggled to pay heating bills. "What can we do?" I asked Mr. Patterson. His smile was grim. "We can do quite a lot. This is elder financial abuse, and it's a serious crime." My sister Ruth lived 2 hours away in a cabin she'd inherited from our aunt. We'd been estranged for 15 years over a petty argument I couldn't even remember clearly. But when I called her, desperate for someone to talk to, she answered like no time had passed. Esther? My God, it's been so long. I broke down completely, telling her everything. The abandonment, the locks, the stolen money. Ruth listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and outrage. Come stay with me, she said immediately. Pack what you need and come up here. We'll figure this out together. Ruth, there's something else. Her voice was heavy. Something I should have told you years ago. Your kids, they came to see me once, about 3 years back. My blood chilled. What did they want? They were asking about having you declared mentally incompetent, said you were showing signs of dementia, that you needed care. They wanted me to back up their story. The room spun around me. What did you tell them? I told them to go to hell. You were sharp as ever when I talked to you. Different from me, maybe, quieter, but not sick. I thought they were just worried, but now I understood. They'd been planning this for years. The power of attorney, the isolation, even our estrangement had been part of their strategy. They said you were worth more locked away than alive, Ruth continued quietly. I left without telling anyone. While my children were at work, I packed 2 suitcases with essentials and walked out of the house I'd called home for 30 years. I left no note, no forwarding address, no explanation. Mrs. Henderson helped me call a taxi. She'd been watching the drama unfold with growing concern, bringing me meals and offering quiet support. You're doing the right thing, dear, she said as I loaded my bags. Sometimes family isn't blood. Ruth's cabin was small but peaceful, nestled in pine trees beside a quiet lake. She welcomed me with fierce hugs and homemade soup, showing me to a tiny bedroom that felt safer than anywhere I'd been in years. Stay as long as you need, she said. We've got a lot of catching up to do. I disconnected my phone and threw it in a drawer. For the first time in months, the constant anxiety in my chest began to ease. No one could call me demanding things. No one could make me feel guilty for breathing their air. My children began calling Ruth's landline within hours. She let the machine pick up, and we listened to increasingly frantic messages. Mom, where are you? This isn't funny. People are asking questions. You need to come home. We're worried sick. Please call us back. But I wasn't ready to speak to them. I wasn't sure I ever would be. Mr. Patterson moved quickly once I gave him permission to freeze everything. Within days, court orders locked down every account connected to Thomas's estate. My children's access to their monthly allowances from their trust fund stopped immediately. The forensic accountant he recommended began tracing every transaction, building an airtight case of financial elder abuse. Credit cards they'd opened in my name were flagged. Loans they'd taken against the house were investigated. This is going to get ugly, Mr. Patterson warned me. They'll fight back hard once they realize what's happening. He was right. The calls to Ruth's house became more desperate, then angry, then threatening. Michael left a message saying they'd have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't return immediately. Jessica threatened to have me arrested for making false accusations. But the legal system was on my side now. The evidence was overwhelming, and Mr. Patterson had connections in elder abuse prosecution. My children had been so confident in their scheme that they'd kept detailed records of their theft. They thought you'd never figure it out, he said. Abusers always underestimate their victims. I found strange comfort in being called a victim. It meant what happened to me was real, that I wasn't imagining the cruelty or exaggerating the betrayal. For the first time in years, someone was taking my side. The story broke in the local newspaper. Millbrook woman abandoned by adult children discovers years of financial abuse. Mrs. Henderson had given an interview describing how she'd watched my children treat me poorly for years. They'd drop by for 5 minutes, grab something from the house, and leave, she told the reporter. Never stayed for dinner, never helped with yard work. That poor woman was so lonely. The story went viral on social media. Complete strangers shared it with comments like, "This is heartbreaking, and those kids should be ashamed." Local TV stations picked it up, interviewing experts about elder abuse and family dynamics. My children tried damage control, posting carefully worded statements about family disputes and misunderstandings. But the court documents were public record, and the truth was harder to spin than their lies. Jessica lost 2 major clients who saw the news coverage. Michael's boss called him in for a meeting about personal issues affecting professional reputation. Brian's art showing was canceled when the gallery owner read about the case. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, just sadness that it had come to this. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years: vindication. Other people could see what I'd been living with. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I was a mother whose children had betrayed her in the cruelest possible way. The unity my children had shown during their intervention crumbled as legal pressure mounted. Recorded phone calls between them, obtained through court order, revealed the cracks in their alliance. "This was your idea, Michael," Jessica screamed in one call. "You said it would be easy money." "I never said abandon her at a truck stop," Michael shot back. "That was Brian's contribution to the plan." "Don't blame me for your guilt," Brian replied. "We all agreed she was getting too dependent." They turned on each other like starving animals, each trying to minimize their own role while maximizing the other's culpability. The prosecution used these recordings to build separate cases against each of them. Michael hired an expensive lawyer and tried to claim he'd only been following his siblings' lead. Jessica attempted to negotiate a plea deal, offering to testify against her brothers. Brian disappeared for a week before being found at a friend's house in another state. Mr. Patterson showed me transcripts of their legal maneuvering. "They're each trying to save themselves," he said. "Classic behavior when conspirators face consequences." Ruth read over my shoulder, shaking her head. "They're still treating you like the enemy instead of the mother they betrayed." I was beginning to realize they'd been treating me like the enemy for years. My silence became my weapon. While my children gave interviews claiming they'd acted out of love and concern, I said nothing publicly. While they crafted elaborate explanations for their behavior, I let the evidence speak for itself. Mr. Patterson advised me that speaking to media could hurt the criminal case, but honestly, I had nothing to say to them anyway. What words could adequately express the depth of their betrayal? What explanation could justify abandoning their elderly mother? My silence forced them to fill the void with their own words, and every statement they made sounded worse than the last. Michael claimed they'd been teaching me independence. Jessica insisted they'd never meant to hurt anyone. Brian said it was all a misunderstanding that got out of hand. The public wasn't buying it. Comments on their social media posts were brutal. Old friends and colleagues distanced themselves. Former clients and business partners looked for reasons to end relationships. Meanwhile, I spent quiet days at Ruth's cabin, reading books, taking walks, rediscovering who I was without the constant stress of managing their expectations and demands. For the first time in decades, I felt peace. Their betrayal had set me free from the prison of trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. The forensic accountant's final report was devastating. Over 6 years, my children had stolen $267,000 through various schemes. Fake power of attorney documents, forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, credit cards opened in my name. The web of deception was staggering. They'd been so systematic about it, so careful to take amounts that wouldn't immediately trigger suspicion. A few hundred here, a few thousand there, always with explanations about helping mom with expenses or managing her investments. But the detailed banking records told the real story. Money transferred to personal accounts, luxury purchases made with credit cards in my name, cash withdrawals that went directly into their pockets. This wasn't desperation, the accountant explained to Mr. Rudd, Patterson and me. This was calculated theft carried out over years. They had a system. The report also revealed something that made my stomach turn. They'd been planning to have me declared incompetent not just for financial control, but to access my share of Thomas's life insurance early. In their minds, I was already dead. Court dates were set, criminal charges filed, asset recovery proceedings began. My children would face not just financial consequences, but potential jail time. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt empty. These were the babies I'd rocked to sleep, the children I'd cheered for at school plays. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers. My children sat at separate tables with their lawyers, refusing to make eye contact with each other or with me. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of their crimes. I testified clearly and calmly, walking the jury through years of manipulation and theft. I showed them the forged documents, explained the abandoned phone calls from Mr. Patterson, described the day they left me at the truck stop. "How did it feel when you realized they'd driven away without you?" the prosecutor asked. Like my heart was being torn out. I answered honestly. These were the children I'd raised alone after their father died. I'd given them everything, and in return, they threw me away like garbage. Michael's lawyer tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman who'd misunderstood normal family financial assistance. But the evidence was overwhelming, and my testimony was clear and consistent. Jessica broke down crying when her recorded phone calls were played, but the jury could hear the calculation in her voice as she discussed how to access more of Mom's money. Brian sat silently through the entire proceeding, staring at his hands. When it was over, the judge's words rang through the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The media attention around the case sparked a national conversation about elder abuse and family betrayal. I received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own stories of adult children who'd stolen from aging parents. "I thought I was the only one," wrote a woman from Oregon. "My son took everything and convinced me it was for my own good." "Thank you for fighting back," said a man from Florida. "My daughter cleaned out my accounts while I was in the hospital. I was too ashamed to report it." The stories broke my heart. How many elderly parents were suffering in silence, too embarrassed to admit their own children were robbing them blind? A victims' rights organization asked me to speak at their annual conference. At first, I declined. Public speaking terrified me, and I wasn't ready to relive my story for strangers. But Ruth convinced me to reconsider. "You could help people," she said. "Other mothers who are going through what you went through." The speech was harder than testifying in court, but the response was overwhelming. Standing ovation, tears, people sharing their own experiences. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like something good might come from my pain. I was no longer just a victim. I was a survivor with a voice. Brian was the first to try reconciliation. He showed up at Ruth's cabin 3 months after the trial, looking thinner and older than I remembered. Ruth answered the door and called for me, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't want to see him," I said from the kitchen. "Mom, please," Brian called through the screen door. "I need to talk to you." Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the porch. He looked genuinely remorseful, his eyes red with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he said. "We were wrong. We were scared about money, scared about taking care of you if you got sick. We thought if we just controlled your finances, we could manage everything better." By stealing from me? We weren't stealing. We were planning ahead, making sure there would be enough for your care when you needed it. The same lies, wrapped in prettier language. Whose idea was it to abandon me at the truck stop? He looked away. That got out of hand. It was supposed to be a prank, just to shake you up a little. I could have died out there, Brian. I had no money, no phone, no way to get help. But you didn't die. You figured it out, just like we knew you would. I stared at my youngest son, seeing clearly for the first time. He wasn't sorry for what they'd done. He was sorry they'd been caught. "I already was sick," I told him quietly. "I was sick of being your mother." The judge's final ruling restored complete control of Thomas's estate to me. The forged power of attorney was nullified. All stolen assets were ordered returned with interest, and my children were permanently barred from any claim to the inheritance. But more importantly, I rewrote Thomas's will entirely. Instead of leaving everything to children who'd proven themselves capable of elder abuse, I established a trust for victims of family financial crimes. The house would be sold, with proceeds funding legal aid for elderly people fighting their own children. My children would inherit nothing. Not because I wanted revenge, but because they'd shown they couldn't be trusted with the responsibility of inheritance. Michael's lawyer sent a formal request for reconsideration, claiming his client had learned from his mistakes and deserved a second chance. Jessica wrote a long letter apologizing and promising to make amends if I'd restore her inheritance. Brian showed up at the cabin twice more, each time with increasingly desperate pleas for forgiveness and financial reconciliation. I responded to none of them. They'd had 30 years to treat me with basic human decency. They'd chosen manipulation, theft, and abandonment instead. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Some trust once shattered can never be repaired. I cut all contact completely. Changed my phone number, blocked their emails, returned their letters unopened. When they tried to reach me through Ruth, she became a fierce guardian of my peace. "She doesn't want to hear from you," she'd tell them firmly. "Stop calling here." The media attention eventually died down, but the consequences for my children lingered. Michael lost his engineering job and struggled to find new employment with a criminal record. Jessica's law license was suspended pending ethics review. Brian's art career never recovered from the public scandal. Some people said I was being too harsh, that family should forgive family. But those people had never been abandoned by their own children at a truck stop. They'd never discovered years of systematic theft by the people they'd trusted most. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices, and consequences were the natural result. For the first time in years, I slept peacefully at night. No phone calls demanding my attention, no manipulation disguised as concern, no walking on eggshells to avoid their anger. I was finally free to be myself, not just someone's mother. I sold the house in Millbrook and used the money to establish the Thomas Thompson Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. We provided free legal assistance to elderly victims of family financial abuse, funded education programs about estate planning, and lobbied for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults. The work was fulfilling in ways I'd never expected. Every case we helped resolve, every elderly person we protected from predatory relatives, felt like a small victory over the forces that had nearly destroyed me. Ruth and I grew closer than we'd ever been as children. She helped me process the grief of losing my children, not to death, but to their own greed and cruelty. She reminded me that I'd been a good mother despite how they'd turned out. "You gave them every opportunity to be decent people," she said one evening as we watched sunset over the lake. "They chose differently. That's not on you." I started receiving birthday cards from my children each year, always with messages about forgiveness and family healing. I never opened them. Mrs. Henderson, who'd moved to a retirement community, told me they still asked neighbors about me. "They seem genuinely sorry," she said during one of our phone calls. "Sorry they got caught," I replied. "There's a difference." Today I sit on the porch of my small cabin, reading a book about resilience in the afternoon sunshine. No phone buzzing with demands, no guilt about not being available every moment. Just the sound of wind through pine trees and the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore. I'm 71 now, and for the first time in decades, I'm truly happy. The foundation is thriving, helping hundreds of elderly victims reclaim their lives and assets. Ruth and I take daily walks, sharing stories and laughter that had been missing from my life for too long. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think about how our children turned out. But I believe he'd be proud of how I fought back, how I refused to remain a victim, how I turned my pain into purpose. My children took my money, my trust, and years of my peace. But in the end, they gave me something invaluable. Freedom from the exhausting of trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. I thought being a good mother meant giving until I had nothing left. It turns out it means knowing when to stop giving. I didn't lose my children that day at the truck stop. I just finally saw them clearly. They threw me away like garbage, but I discovered I was actually gold.